You're listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, brought to you by the Raven Creek Social Club, where we talk about faith and other oddities. For questions, comments, or to be part of the conversation, join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where you can find us at Raven Creek SC. Now for your hosts, Emily Dixon and Nathan Underwood.
Well, hey everyone, welcome back to Faith and Other Oddities. We're still doing the thing here in the studio, talking about the Bible, reading the Bible.
Had to purge the munchkins from among us before we could get started.
Yeah, I got to run the kids out. The oldest wants so bad to be a part of this, but I think she would kind of be a little bit bored just sitting in here because
Yeah,
we don't have a microphone for her.
that could be dangerous.
Yeah, give the 7-year-old a microphone.
Well, and she's just too freaking smart. And she would probably ask me a question I couldn't answer.
Yeah, she is.
I mean,
she's a pretty intelligent child.
yeah, she's a good kid. It's fun whenever you have nieces and nephews that are smart because then you get to mess with their brains. And you aren't the parent. You don't have to deal with the fallout. So
Mhm.
I'm really enjoying having, other people's kids to inflict.
Sure. Well, that being said, there are people who want to hear what kind of weird things we think of
About the Bible?
about the Bible.
Okay.
Specifically.
Okay. Well, because
We're going to have to limit you to that.
Darn it. No, actually, there's so much in the Bible, we will never get through it all. But we left off in 2 Samuel, verse 10. We'd been talking about the sons of wickedness and how we have got this really weird wording that's only found 3 times in the Bible. And it's really interesting to me that nobody picks up on that language. And the thing is, I think when we look at what follows that verse, and when we start moving forward in what God's saying, the issue of parentage is huge. So the fact that God is making this contrast between his sons, David being his son, and later Solomon being his son, with the sons of wickedness, I think that we need to be taking that as it's written and not trying to impose some kind of idiom to make it easier or more tasteful upon Christians. Because in verse 11, this is what God says. It says, from the time of, we're going to keep going past verse 11, but we're going to start with verse 11. Let's start there. I've got so much information in my brain. It's like bumper cars, all the thoughts. But verse 11, from the time I appointed judges over my people Israel, and I will give you rest from all enemies. Moreover, the Lord declares to you that the Lord will make you a house. So weird verse break, because you got to remember these numbers for chapter and verse were not part of the original manuscript. They were added later. And the person who did this, whose name I forgot, he was doing this under some weird circumstances, and sometimes his breaks don't always make sense, and that can really impact how we read the scripture. So, but the writer is saying the enemy nations are not going to oppress Israel the way they did during the time of Judges. If you followed us through our Judges series, you know that basically everything would be going good. People would start messing up. God would say, I've had enough. And he would bring in another nation, the Midianites, the Philistines, the Moabites. And he would say, I'm going to put you under these other nations to oppress you so that you will call out to me, so that you will turn back to me. And then he would raise up a judge. The judge would run them out of the country, and the people would do fine until the next time. And we did that. Was it 7 times that we did that in the book of Judges?
It was a few.
So, yeah. So God's saying, okay, we're done with that system. This is not how it's going to work. And so David's going to have rest, unlike the judges. So God also does something really interesting here, and he flips the script. David had proposed that he builds God a house. God says, I'm going to get ready to build you a house. David was speaking of a physical structure. God is talking about a legacy.
Right.
So God literally redefines the conversation by redefining the word. And I think that's really cool that God says, hey, you're using the word wrong. You're approaching this in the wrong manner, because my house really isn't about a building. It is about the people who fill those buildings. So again, some great teaching points from that. But verse 12, when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you who shall come from your body, and I will establish your kingdom. Notice the emphasis. Your offspring comes from your body. Now, why in the world would God need to clarify that this offspring would come from David's body?
Would it have anything to do with the Nephilim?
That is absolutely one aspect that it could have from the Nephilim. It could have something to do with the fact that David was not Saul's son. He was Saul's son-in-law who took over. So there's that.
Could it also be denoting that, hey, kingship in my country is not about kingship in Israel is not about embodying the son of a god,
Right, because
or being a supernatural being.
Yes, because the other kings of other nations, what we've got to remember, they were conceived in a ritualized sex act,
Mhm.
and where either the god was believed to descend and have sex with this temple prostitute, or the god was believed to possess the king to have sex with the queen or temple prostitute in this temple. And this is how we get people like Gilgamesh, who were considered 2/3 divine, because the human king, was believed to be conceived in the same way. So he was partly divine.
Mhm.
And then he was divine. And then you've got the god inhabiting the king, possessing the king.
Mhm.
And so he is divine, obviously. So the child has two fathers now and an earthly mother. So the offspring is 2/3 divine.
And so what you have here for anyone playing at home, when you think about it, this ritual prostitution, part of the reason it's so offensive is not because it's just, oh, it's dirty sex.
Mhm.
It's because it's a ritual. Why am I struggling with that word? A ritual reenacting of the Genesis 6 account.
Yes. Yes.
And it's saying, it's not just saying we're gonna. It is, but it isn't. It's not just saying we want to
Mhm.
worship other gods. It's saying we want to worship other gods so badly we want their presence to manifest here physically.
Yes.
I mean, it's when you get really down to it, and so
And gods who will oppress women through sex and
Mhm.
use sex to control them. What does God never do in his word? He never uses sex to control a woman.
Right.
And, huge difference that we overlook because we don't understand the basis of where these kingships and why they were so significant, comes from.
Mhm.
And so when God says this son is going to come from your own body,
Mhm.
he's saying that David is not going to participate in the things these other nations have participated in.
Yeah, and then when you do get to the conception of Jesus, who is the God man conceived of God, he's not conceived
There's
in a ritual sex act at the temple.
Yeah, and there's no human participant embodying or allowing this God to possess.
Right.
And so it is completely supernatural, not quasi supernatural. And that's the funny thing, too. I just thought of this. When you look at manifestations of evil, what we have in the Bible is they almost do the miracle. They almost do the same thing that God's doing.
Right.
They never do it in the complete way that God is doing it. So there is that facade of power. There is this facade of something that should evoke wonder, but it always falls short.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, the offense should be so high that people would say, we want to worship a God that deals with their part and parcel with humanity is sexual oppression of women.
Right.
So, we could probably look at some really interesting implications that flow out of that for today's church, but we won't.
Well, and that's the thing. I mean, when you look at the place for sex in the Hebrew culture and in the in Christianity,
Mhm.
it's not supposed to be with the temple prostitutes. It's supposed to be in the home. It's supposed to be private. It's and so that there is no mistaking of what's going on out
Who's
there.
participating in what and who's present. And well, and okay, so real quick, because this has been a huge topic, and we even saw a post this morning, you and I were talking about it, about wives submitting to their husbands sexually. Okay, totally cool with that. But what everybody, and when I say totally cool with that, that's in a healthy, loving relationship where it's not being used as a weapon. So I make that caveat.
Yeah, because I mean, yeah, and everyone wants to seem to forget that we're, as the body of Christ, we're commanded to submit to one another,
That exactly.
and that men are supposed to love their wives, and
Yeah,
I mean,
well,
and
Paul talks about that. The wife's body does not belong to herself, and the husband's body does not belong to himself. This is a radical thing. It's a two-way street, and never before in the cultures was it a two-way street.
right,
And so the fact that a wife had this right to her husband's body, and to say it belongs to me within this covenant relationship and not to be shared with everybody else, was completely flipping the script for that culture.
mhm,
And so we just think, oh, well, it's just talking about women because that's the only thing they put on a meme. Memes are horrible things to get your theology from.
yeah,
But yeah.
effective conversation starters, but
And if
it's
if you're going to use it to start a conversation, then absolutely go for it. But please, please, please take it further.
yeah. Well,
Um,
I mean, just I don't know. I don't know if this needs to be the show about sex and marriage, but I mean, the church has just got to do a better job at communicating about it,
mhm.
and
Quit hiding behind euphemisms.
quit hiding behind euphemisms, and letting providing effective tools for couples
Mhm.
that, because it really seems like there's, I don't know, one of the churches that Mickey and I went to for a while, they had a class, and it was a regular class that repeated, and one of the Mickey asked one of the other women in the church about, what she thought of it, and she was like, we've had some friends who have attended it, but we're not going because we're not going to discuss our sex life in a group. So it's either like not discussed at all, or we're expected to
Too
share
much
it in a weird
oversharing.
way, and it's like, there doesn't seem to be a good balance.
Right.
And we've got to figure out a way to work on letting people know, yeah, you have to have a conversation, and
Mhm.
part of submitting to one another is having a conversation
Uh-huh.
and developing healthy expectations
Yes. Yes.
for both parties.
Yes.
And
And
a-
yeah.
and again, we
This is
didn't
where I'm
mean
cutting off because I've got like so many scandalous conversations in my head that
I
are
know.
great examples, but I don't want to take, again, not the right format for those conversations.
Well, and I don't want this to become just the
Right.
marital counseling show. It's like that's not at all where we're started, but this is kind of more the esoteric
Well, but
uses of sex.
since we brought it up, I do want to give a really great resource to Love, Honor, and Vacuum. Oh my goodness. And such a great resource for men and women. Sheila, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce her last name because I haven't heard it pronounced out loud and I'd probably butcher it. But she actually did a 20,000 woman study of mostly Christian
A
women.
survey, yeah.
Yeah. Well, and it's being submitted for peer review right now.
Sure.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, this is how good what the quality of the study that was done, the survey that she offered, and talking about what women have been taught about sex. And she has written a great book. It's just launched the 1st of March. So this is actually really timely that we bring it up. If you want some good, healthy, balanced Christian perspective on the sexual relationship in marriage and how that should be something that is fulfilling and joyful for both partners, go check out her website, check out her blogs. She has some very specific targeted posts about mechanics and communication skills. And, she's not shy about it. And I love that. But uh, I bring it up and because number one, we just kind of, fell into that rabbit hole. But at the same time, this kind of teaching and the views on marriage, excuse me, that come out of these spiritual principles impact how we live our faith.
Yeah.
And so,
And Christian men, the sentence that is going to fix your sex life is never going to be, "You need to submit to me."
right, right. If you have to tell someone that, you're probably not a great leader. You know, just just to be honest. Now, if you can inspire submission because you're being loving and kind and honorable in the way you conduct yourself, that's a great blessing.
hmm
And it's not something that any woman feels coerced to give if it's inspired and not commanded. And so, uh, and now women, we submit to, and I know this is going to be controversial, we submit to our husbands sometimes as an act of will, just to help be obedient. And even that submission comes with certain caveats. And I know some people are going to hate that, but if you got a problem with it and you're a woman, join us in Scandalous. We'll talk it. We'll hash it all out. So anyway, back to David. So yes, we have this instance where he's being told the son is going to come from his own body. One, to refute that idea that absolutely not. This is not going to be a Nephilim. This is not going to be a Rephaim. This is not going to be any of those half human, half divine hybrids. This is a human being that God is going to choose. It's also saying that this son is going to be David's son. He's not going to be adopted in like David was into Saul's family. He's not going to be an outsider brought in to fulfill this role of a son because none of the sons qualify. It also says that it's not going to be a trusted servant. Remember with Abraham, with Eleazar, Abraham says,
Right.
It,
Just to be clear,
yeah,
kind of thing.
Absolutely. And so, and
We've had people looking for loopholes in this in the past, apparently.
well, and that's the thing. That's what people do with rules. You give, not just the Bible, but with rules, people look for loopholes. And, you and I are some of the best at that. We were trained by the world's expert in that, our father. And so
living with our father was like a master class in semantics.
Exactly. And so, God's like, we're going to just cut out all the ambiguity and I'm going to say exactly what I mean and exactly what you need to know. So, thank God for that. But Psalms 89, again, connected. And it's this connection where we're going to see very specifically laid out this rejection of other cultural norms and practices. And when Psalms 89, verse 36, we see a pairing of the offspring and the throne, just like it's been used here in 2 Samuel 7. And we also find this concept of how this eternal kingship works as part of the fabric of other ancient cultures. So we find it in some Assyrian text, and we find it in some Phoenician text, and we'll look at some of those. But when we find the Bible taking borrowed language from other cultures, and we've talked about this before, what the Bible will do, it'll take these words and these phrases and concepts from the cultures that surround the nation of Israel, things that the people of Israel are very familiar with. And just like God took that word house earlier, that bet, and redefined it for David within this context, God does the same thing with these foreign concepts.
Takes it from being a building and makes it like the Klingon sense, like the House of Moog.
Yeah.
Or Martok
or if we wanted to, go historical,
Gowron.
We could say the House of Hillel and the House of Shammai.
I'm bringing in something people might understand if they're nerds like me,
Right. Yeah, but this idea of a legacy, and so when God uses these phrases, we shouldn't be afraid of them. He is repurposing them, to use a Pinterest of terminology there. So yeah, he's saying, I'm going to make the definition conform to my reality. I'm not subject to their reality.
Right.
And so we're going verse 13. He says, and he shall build a house for my name. And he's talking about David's son. And I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. So God's going to build this dynasty that David is going to be the head of. And it's this dynasty in turn is going to build God's house. So God builds David a house. And then the dynasty, or the house of David, will build God a house. So, this is this is kind of this reciprocal relationship we see with God and humanity that's portrayed throughout the Bible. And it's kind of boiled down within this one family line. And the son of David is going to owe his success to God's direct intervention, just like David does.
Mhm.
And verse 14, and I think this is an interesting verse. It says, I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men, with stripes of the sons of men. So this verse is specifically speaking of Solomon. We're going to know this later on. We're going to see how this gets fulfilled. And Solomon's going to be adopted by God. And now the thing is, divine adoption is not something you find in any other culture, according to most scholars. Now, I haven't had a time to read all of the ancient literature to see if that's true, but most scholars.
Can't believe you haven't read every ancient piece of
I
literature.
know I should make better use of my time, but but it's definitely not so common that anything I've read cites it, and it's not so common that people say that it's there. So it makes sense too when you think of the way it happened. Gods didn't need to adopt sons.
Right.
These sons were supposed to be the progeny of these gods, so adoption was irrelevant to them.
Mhm.
And so here we have like this crazy statement where God is claiming a son by divine fiat, and instead of fathering a son, a biological son. And the references to discipline here, these are limiting statements. God's saying, I'm not going to pour out all of my divine wrath on him. I'm going to chastise him the way a human father chastises a human son.
Mhm. Mhm.
It's not destruction. It really is correction, which has some really crazy implications. But the biggest thing is we know this can't be talking about Jesus.
Right.
And so we need to be careful not to read too much into this too quickly.
Yeah. And kind of also, did it ever say like how old Solomon was when he took the throne?
I'm not there yet. Don't push me.
Okay. Sorry, I'm expecting you to be precognitive now.
Yeah, no, I probably knew the answer to that at one point, but I've slept since
Sure.
then.
I'm sure it's something we could look up easily.
Yeah.
That's I'll do that here in a minute just to satisfy my own curiosity.
But this idea that God can say, "Hey, I'm going to adopt a son," was again that radical departure from what was expected. Verse 15. But my steadfast love will not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you. Now it's interesting to note that First Chronicles 17, which is a recount of this conversation between David and God, completely omits any reference to Saul. And so we have nothing said about him in First Chronicles. Why? Because we're looking at David. The writer of Chronicles really doesn't care about Saul. He wants us to know what God does with David. And you have to kind of imagine that some of this was made, these promises were made to kind of allay David's fears, because David had stepped in and taken over Saul's house. God's love had departed from Saul. David had seen the outcome and the ramifications of what happened to Saul when that happened to him. And so when David's, he's in the same position Saul was, anointed by God, chosen by God, because Saul was all of those things.
Mm-hmm.
And God leaves Saul, and he sends an evil spirit to torment Saul. You got to think that somewhere in the back of David's mind, he's got to think that's a little bit of a possibility.
I mean, I guess probably. I mean,
well, you got to remember too, he's responsible for mediating and mitigating the impact of that evil spirit on Saul.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
He sat there in that throne room while Saul was losing his mind and had spears flung at him. So this was not something like where we've, spent weeks and kind of, we read about it, but we didn't live it.
Yeah. We get the advantage of the privilege of looking back on it.
Yeah, and so and when you have those big life experiences, they leave a mark.
Mm-hmm,
And so when you think of David's that shepherd boy who got called out of the field, put in the royal court, and now he's responsible for the mental health of this adult, this king of Israel, that's going to leave a mark.
Sure. Okay.
And
yeah,
so, I mean,
I follow.
Yeah, that's, I think sometimes we forget the progress of David. And so, here he is, he's talking about building a temple for God. And just a few chapters ago, he was nobody. And his life has just been this crazy roller coaster ride, and it's the same person. It's not David the shepherd and then another David the king, like some people have suggested. There's actually suggestions that there are like several different Davids in this book that have all been lumped together into one narrative, but they aren't the same person. That's not what the Bible's telling us. It's the same person,
Right.
which honestly should give us a lot of hope when we look at our own lives to think, okay, if David could go through all of this, and this is where he wound up, what can God do with my life? So, anyway, verse 16. And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure from forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. So, again, this verse all refers to Solomon. He's the biological son of David. He's going to be adopted by God. He will commit iniquity. It's not an if, it's a when. He's going to mess it up. God's going to discipline him. And this is not so much of this does apply directly to Solomon alone, but there is also that aspect of beyond. Because when we start talking about your throne shall be established forever, now we're moving beyond Solomon, because we all know that David's dynasty isn't going to last forever.
Sure.
It's not going to endure in the literal sense. And within this context of Samuel, we do find the idea of divine kingship and forever or eternal kingship really connected, that you've got to have the God part with the human part for there to be an eternal kingdom. The two have to meet together. And so I want to look at how this is addressed in some parallel cultures. And so I'm going to read from the Code of Hammurabi, which I think a lot of us are already familiar with. And so
I know of it. I haven't read it.
Why not? No, it's really interesting what's in there because
Don't read cuneiform?
well, that kind of, they have English translations anyway. And by the way, again, not hidden knowledge from the rest of the world. You can go online, look up the Code of Hammurabi. You can find PDFs of direct translations. It's not hidden. So, that's the great thing about the time we live in. You can find all this, and you don't have to be an expert, and you don't even have to go to a specialized library anymore.
You don't even have to go to the public library anymore.
Right? Yeah, you can just... sitting on the toilet on your phone, you can find all this stuff. It's crazy how far we've come. So, anyway, so from the Code of Hammurabi, when the august king Anu, king of Ananaku deities, and the god of Enlil, the lord of heaven and earth, who determines the destinies of the land, allotted supreme power over all the peoples of Marduk, the firstborn son of the god Ea, exalted him among the Agigu deities, named the city of Babylon with its august name, and made it supreme within the regions of the world, and established for him within it eternal kingship, whose foundations are as fixed as heaven and earth. So we have the same words, eternal kingship. So, and that language sounds so familiar. I mean, all of it, we think of it as being part of biblical language. Well, don't be surprised. It's not saying that the Bible's a knockoff. It's not ripping off everybody else's stories. We talk like the people we talk like because this is the culture we're in.
Yep.
And so it's the same thing. So from the Baal cycle, as for your enemy, O Balu, for your enemy you'll smite, you'll destroy your adversary, you'll take your eternal kingship, your sovereignty that endures from generation to generation. This is from a letter to a Ugaritic king. I do pronounce you Balu Sepuni, the eternal son, the Ataru, the Anatu, and all the gods of Elishia, prayers of splendor for your eternal kingship. Again, so the phrase is there, and there's several Assyrian king scripts that also contain references to eternal kingship. I'm not going to read all those, but I think you're kind of getting the sense. Eternal kingship is the right of a divine king. You don't expect a kingship to fade away if it's sponsored by a deity. And so the thing is, everyone in Israel knew this. This was not some kind of sudden revelation to Israel. Oh, wait a minute, there can be eternal kingship. God can do this. This is what happens when you have deity involved in a king's life. They knew it.
Hmm.
This is just true. And what is so crazy about it, God is saying, I can take this kingdom that's made up of a bunch of interlopers, this ragtag crew that just happened to wander into Canaan, who had quote unquote no right to the land.
Hmm.
I'm going to establish them as an eternal kingship. Or to put it another way, the God of Israel has displaced the Canaanite gods and is exposing their promises of eternal kingship as lies while instituting his own eternal rule in their place. He's overturning all the things that happened in the Tower of Babel. So
Hmm.
we're right back there when God dispersed the nations and he allotted them according to the sons of God, when those divine beings took over, and God said, "Hey, Israel's mine. This is my place. Y'all guys can do whatever you want, wherever you want.
Hmm.
Go to your
Hmm.
rooms, make that noise. But in my place, in my house, you don't get to act this way." Now God's saying, yeah, you've been in there. You've made a mess. I'm coming back.
Right.
I'm redeeming the land. And so this king that he's putting over his land, though, when you put it in the context of what's going on within these other kingdoms, the kingdoms that had been in this country ever since Jacob and his sons went down to Egypt to escape the famine
Hmm.
hundreds and hundreds of years ago, this is beyond wild and inconceivable, because David's not the son of a nobleman. He is not one of the Rephaim. He's not one of the Nephilim, unlike Saul, who could be, I mean, Saul wasn't, but Saul could be mistaken for one.
Right.
And so here we've got this shepherd. We got the youngest son, the forgotten the son who wasn't even invited to the dinner when the prophet showed up.
Hmm.
He's an outlaw. He's been called a terrorist. He's been run out of his own land and separated from God according to his own words. And now God says, hey, you are my son. Why? Because I said so.
Right.
For the people at this time, this would have been such a new concept that it would have taken a lot to wrap their minds around. Now, we as Christians, why can we call ourselves sons and daughters of God? Because God said so.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're so comfortable with it. It doesn't even phase us. It's
Hmm.
just a part of our Christian vernacular. To these people back at this point in time, it wouldn't have even made sense. They would have had to wrestle with this to even accept it. I mean, this is like somebody saying the sky's purple and not blue, or red and not blue. I mean, it just goes against everything they know, because functionally, David was nobody. He was nothing, with absolutely no right to the kingship. He couldn't even claim that he was a great warrior when he was chosen to be a king.
Right.
He didn't become a great warrior until after God chose him.
Hmm.
So everything in David's story is reversed. And so the the really cool part of this is God's going to take this nobody that he has brought up for himself,
Hmm.
and he's going to use David to execute judgment on these illegitimate gods and kings within Canaan.
Yeah.
And going back to what you were saying in last week's.
Yeah. He's putting the fight back where it belongs.
Hmm.
So I think that's a pretty interesting uh thing of turn of events.
Well, and when you bring all of this conversation back to all this background information to this conversation, now this conversation is so much bigger than God going, hey, guess what? You can have a pretty throne to sit on, and you can
Mhm.
have a nice palace, and oh yeah, you're going to rule over Israel. Oh, that's great. Even that idea of ruling and being a king, some of the splendor is gone in our minds, because we have had so many depictions of kings in movies and books, and it's kind of like, oh, this is what happens to good people.
Right.
It's not. Cinderella doesn't get to become the queen. Snow White doesn't get to, live with Prince Charming forever. That's not real life.
Mhm.
And these people here, they understood that. And David understood that. And so I it just the very fact that David could be king was awe-inspiring.
Mhm.
And it should be awe-inspiring. So we're going to pause the conversation between God and David here. And we're going to move into Psalms 89. And this is, we're doing this because, as Zamora noted, Psalm 89 explains Psalm 7, or Samuel 7. So I love this psalm. Man, it's long. So we're probably going to spend the rest of this episode and going into the next episode because it is a long psalm. And I'm like, we just need to go through all of it. Psalm 89, it's unique because it is a song of lament. However, it's a reverse psalm of lament. Most songs of lament begin with the author pouring out their questions and
It starts the lament. They kind of get themselves straightened out by the end of it.
Yes, yeah. Why have we been afflicted? And why is evil part of this world? And where are you, God, in the middle of all this? And he spends his time railing against injustice for a while, and he demands to know what God's going to do about it. But then he he begins, like you said, to get himself kind of lined out, and he begins to understand God's sovereign, God's king, and he needs to trust that. Now, this psalm actually begins with affirming God's faithfulness and celebrating God's love with this kind of renewed commitment by the psalmist. And so we open with these affirmations and praises, but we close with unresolved questions and unanswered demands of God. So instead of rising to this crescendo of praise, we're left with this minefield full of doubts. And that's very unusual for any psalm. And so, despite the fact that this begins as probably some of the highest praise in all of Psalms for God and his person, it often ends up being a psalm that's neglected and ignored because it doesn't leave you comforted.
Hmm.
It actually still leaves you very conflicted. And this is not a modern phenomenon. I kind of mentioned this last week. Ibn Ezra, who was a rabbi who lived around 1160, he recounts the story of a scholar who considered this, the last half of the psalm, to be some of the most blasphemous things ever written.
Right.
And he says, and he based his own view of the psalm on that, and he refused to even acknowledge that the psalmist wrote the words, and he said that these were things that idolaters were writing about God and had added to the psalms to corrupt it. So he did not believe it was actually part of the canon. Um, there's this idea that reading the Psalms was very blasphemous because it does present a very it's a troubling view of God. I mean, and we're going to get into that, and you're going to see, oh, wait a minute, this isn't how we like to think about God. But he would even, when he talked about the story of the scholar Ibn Ezra, he actually said the scholar refused to hear it read in his presence because he didn't want to hear that kind of blasphemy.
Hmm.
And so when we start looking at problems with the modern church reading the Psalms, we can know it goes back to some very deep roots. Now, other rabbis read this part of the Psalms very closely to how Christians read it, which David's reign might not be perfect and it may not have perfect continuity, but it is established and it would be established in the Messiah. Now, the Jews are still looking for the Messiah. We as Christians, obviously, we believe that Christ is the Messiah. Jesus is the Messiah. I shouldn't say Christ is the Messiah because Christ is the Greek word for
the Messiah, which means the anointed one.
Yes.
The
So
anointed one is the anointed one.
Yeah,
Oh,
exactly.
good on you.
So the superscription of the psalm attributes it to Ethan the Ezraite. I love trying sometimes getting all these vowels in. Ezraite. Ezra is almost the same name as Zerah, and Zerah is found in First Chronicles 2:6, and we find that Ethan is a son of Zerah along with Heman. And Heman the Ezrahite is credited with writing Psalm 88. And in First Kings 4:31, Solomon is praised as being wiser than the sons of Zerah, who were considered to be exceptionally wise in their own right. So I'm giving this background for a reason. We're going to get into this more, but at First Chronicles 15:9, Ethan and Heman were named by David as temple musicians, specifically to sing and play the bronze cymbals.
Hmm.
And why is all this important? Okay, if you accept the superscription as being correct, then the psalm is written no later than the reign of Solomon.
Okay.
Okay, it could be written as early as during the reign of King David, but the timeline is very close. And if you accept it as being written at that point in time, now the psalm's prophetic. It's looking forward to that
Mhm.
time when David's dynasty is cut off. And we know that eventually the dynasty is going to be cut off. The people are going to be sent into exile, and the Davidic throne has yet to be reestablished on this earth. Now, of course, most modern scholars don't accept the superscription as being part of the original text. They think they were added later.
Mhm.
Whether or not they were based on tradition that would associate that particular author to that particular psalm is up into debate. And if that's the case, then this is someone in the middle of the exile saying, hey, this psalm reflects our experience today.
Right.
So there's also the possibility, according to some scholars, that it wasn't written until they were in exile. I I I'm always going to go with the earlier dates. That's just who I am and how I'm kind of wired. I think that even if it wasn't specifically written down at the earliest date attributed to it, it was still in existence, at least in the oral tradition.
Right.
And so I'm always going to I'm always going
That's
to
just how
fall
you
there.
tend to lean that way.
Yeah, so full disclosure there. But either way, no matter what you think about it, we have this glimpse into the Davidic Covenant,
Mhm.
and we see how it was supposed to function and the purpose behind it. Now, the idea of temple musicians being seers, which seers, if we remember back our
Mhm.
discussions with Samuel, that's the earliest name and title given to prophets in the Bible.
Right.
That's explicitly stated in the text. First Chronicles 25 begins with a list of temple musicians and their duties. Heman and his sons are described as prophesying with lyres,
Mhm.
kinnors, so
Mhm.
you can go back to that episode if you like, harps and cymbals. All the sons of Heman were known as the king's seers, according to the promise of God to exalt him, David. There, that's verse 5.
Okay.
So this implies that the gift of serving of seeing or prophesying is a familial gift that does run in families.
Okay.
Now, Heman and Ethan were brothers, and since I don't have any problem with prophesying being a part of the artistic musical gifting. For those of y'all in the paddle store, you can see my thesis. It's in the files. I don't have a problem with the superscription being going back to these temple musicians prophesying, hey, this is what's going on.
Sure.
And so now the other part of this too is even if this was not written before the exile, it still is a prophetic psalm in the sense that it reveals something about the supernatural realm.
Mhm.
Only a prophet, only a seer can look into the supernatural realm and report back to mere mortals, what's going on.
Right.
And so that kind of gives us the background for the psalm. It is prophetic. It is all about the supernatural and also how that supernatural impacted the Davidic reign. So wherever you want to put it as far as time-wise, doesn't matter. The point is you're still going to come up with the same message.
Mhm.
So just one way to look at how to deal with the conflict concerning this, because there's lots of conflict. Verse 1 says, I will sing of the steadfast love of the Lord forever. With my mouth, I will make known your faithfulness to all generations. So here we have our first lexical connection, shared words between 2 Samuel 7 and Psalms 89, steadfast love, chesed. And 2 Samuel 7:15 says, my steadfast love will not depart from him. So here, this is God's talking to David through Nathan. And so Malbin, who is one of the rabbis we've referenced before, he defines faithfulness as a natural course of events. And I think this is really interesting. And God's steadfast love as God's supernatural deeds for humanity. So he reads the psalm as contrasting. There's the faithfulness to all generations, which is just the natural course of events.
Mhm.
But the steadfast love, this chesed, is God's supernatural investiture into David's house specifically. And while we don't have the word for generation in 2 Samuel 7, the idea is definitely there. I'm going to give you a son of your own body.
Mhm.
So obviously, this existence of generations within a dynasty is something that I think all of us should be able to grasp without having to have that specific word.
Right.
Now, if Malbim's definitions are correct, then the rule of David is sponsored by and is an expression of God's supernatural work upon this earth. So the Davidic kingdom is not just God saying, hey, I need somebody to hold this place for me. It is directly supernatural. And so by the way of Micah 7:2, the sages connect steadfast love as a quality exhibited only to Abraham. And Micah 7:20. And they read this verse as the beginning of a connection between David and Abraham.
Mhm.
And we're going to see that this is very accurate. And we're going to have lots of evidence pointing us that direction. And we've already seen some.
Right. Pardon me. Our children seem to be active today.
It sounds like they're having fun, though. So, a little violent fun, maybe, but they're having fun. So,
That one sounds more like a fit. We may need to go investigate that in a moment. So,
you're the dad. I let you make the call. This is a great thing. I have no responsibility in this.
yeah, being the aunt.
So, verse 2, for I said, steadfast love will be built up forever. In the heavens, I will establish your faithfulness. So, again, that contrast between steadfast love and faithfulness. But we also have this concept of building, which we found again in 2 Samuel 7, the entire revelation that came from David through Nathan, from God through Nathan, centers on David's desire to build a temple.
Mhm.
And then, it gets flipped to God's promise to build David a house or a dynasty. Now, forever, this is Ed Olam. It's found in 2 Samuel 7. A kingdom established forever. It was a manifestation of the steadfast love. So the Targum reads that the world itself, what we inhabit today, is built on steadfast love, and the sole purpose of creation is so God can bestow his steadfast love on humanity. So our support and our reality that we inhabit was an expression of steadfast love so that God could in turn give steadfast love.
Hmm.
And I kind of like the way they look at it, because it is about what we were talking about last week. It's that pleasure and joy God has in his creation. But it all begins with God's reigns in the heaven, which God reigns in the heavens and on his throne with his divine court, and now it has to be manifest on the earth. And this is most notably done through the reign of David. So verse 3, you have said, I have made a covenant with my chosen one. I have sworn to David, my servant. Now, the word covenant doesn't appear in 2 Samuel 7, but Zamora points out that this psalm in its explanation of 2 Samuel 7 is evidence that 2 Samuel 7 was understood as a covenant promise between David and God.
Mhm.
And we have several different places where God's eternal covenant are referenced by that title, but there's never a point where God says, this is my covenant. So when we're looking at David's David's life, this has to be the conversation where the covenant is made,
Right.
even though the technical term isn't there. And then we got to remember too, eternal covenant is only used 16 times in the Bible. So it's not a phrase that gets thrown around a lot. It's only used really when we're talking about technical passages that are being very specific.
Okay.
And and this whole situation with God and David in Samuel 7 really feels like two people having a conversation less than this formalized event. And we're going to talk about where we can see clues of that even more when we get to David's response. But we also have, again, my servant, David, my servant. We find David, my servant, or my servant David in 2 Samuel 7. So Isaiah 55:3 says, "Incline your ear, come to me and hear that your soul may live, and I will make with you an everlasting covenant." It's also eternal. My steadfast, sure love for David. Behold, I have made him a witness to the people, a leader, a commander for the people. Behold, you shall call a nation you do not know, and a nation that did not know you will run to you, because the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, has glorified you. So this passage is all about God's compassion for Israel. David's rule is compassion for the nation because it's the covenant God made with him.
Interesting.
It's crazy when you begin to see how the prophets even address this. And you got to remember, the prophets at this point, with Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel, the end's already there.
Right.
And they're still saying this reign of David is compassion, this covenant community. They're still clinging to this. And Isaiah there specifically said, hey, God's compassion for the entire world is based on David's reign.
Yeah.
And this covenant God made with him. Jeremiah 32:40. I will make them an everlasting covenant, that I will not turn away from doing good to them, and I will put the fear of me in their hearts, that they may not turn from me. I will rejoice in doing them good. I will plant them in this land in faithfulness and with all my heart and all my soul. Again, everlasting covenant. And the idea of planting, we find all of this language in 2 Samuel. So we got this in Isaiah, we got it in Jeremiah. Ezekiel 37. I'm not going to read the entire part of this. This is from verse 24 through 28. I'm just going to pull out some key phrases we find in that passage.
Right.
David, my servant, the shepherd, everlasting covenant, set up a sanctuary in their midst, is something that this is referring to. Specifically, verse 28. It says, the nations will know that I am the Lord who sanctifies Israel when my sanctuary is in the midst forevermore. So that concept of forever. So even though we don't have the word covenant in Samuel 7, we see that when the prophets talk about this, they're going to say, this is the everlasting covenant.
Right.
This is where we have to look back. And they all circle back to these shared terms. David is God's servant. God gives steadfast love. He's faithful. All these words are found in these passages. He's establishing a land for Israel, specifically for a place to worship. And God's reign extends to Israel and then to all the earth based on the basis of David's kingship. You can start to see how this is laying the foundation for what's going to be manifest in the New Testament.
Right.
And it gets really exciting. And so, it lays the basis for, if you want to be a part of God's kingdom, you absolutely can, because God told David it's going to be there. So verse 4, I will establish your offspring forever and build your throne for all generations. So 2 Samuel 7:12 says, and I will raise up your offspring. 2 Samuel 15:16 says, we have the word twice. And we know that this is a physical political throne that will not endure forever.
It's a physical political what?
It's a political...
A political, did you say term?
Throne.
Throne, okay.
Throne.
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
I misheard you.
Yeah, a physical and a political throne. And we know it doesn't last forever. And the thing is, the Second Temple Jews, which is, the people who were teaching at the time Jesus was alive, the sages, the rabbis, everybody that went after it, they know that. So they had to figure out a way to read this all of these promises, not just here in Samuel, but also where the Psalms talk about it and where the prophets talk about it in a way that dealt with the facts of the situation without turning loose of the truth of the situation.
hmm
And so the solution was to see this as a future event and the hope that it would be realized under the Messiah, which is how we as Christians read it. We believe that Jesus is the one who reigns from David's throne. And,
Right.
that has it happened physically on the earth yet? Absolutely not. But notice the wording in Revelation 1 4 through 6. I love it when you can go from beginning to end.
Yeah.
It says, grace to you and peace from him who is and who was and who is to come, and from the seven spirits who are before his throne, divine council language,
hmm
and from the from Jesus Christ, Christ again, Messiah, like we were talking earlier, the faithful witness, the firstborn of the dead, the ruler of the kings of earth, to him who loves us and has freed us from our sins by his blood, made us a kingdom, priest to his God and Father. To him be glory and dominion forever and ever. Amen. So this everlasting covenant of the Messiah, God's chosen one, his servant, the faithful witness, all of these words that we've been hearing through all of this other part right here in Revelation,
hmm
they're fulfilled in Jesus. And he is the one who is an offspring of David, of his own body.
Yeah.
This is why we have these genealogies in Matthew and Luke.
hmm
God did not forget the promise of that he made to David in that moment, because it wasn't just a promise to David, it was a promise to the whole world.
Right. Yeah. Promise to the earth
Eh, eh,
and the people in it.
Yeah, and
And
so
and yeah, I'll keep going. I'm sorry. I was
no,
about
go
to get
ahead.
into something else, but I think it's a little too far off from what we're talking about. But
We'll see. We may wind up there anyway. Uh, but the thing is, at the same time, there's no need for God to adopt Jesus. So there's this really weird kind of tension of play. God adopts Solomon.
hmm
God doesn't have to adopt Jesus. So Jesus fully embodies both the expected promise of David, but also the cultural expectations in being a son of God.
right.
And so this is a solution nobody from David's time would have seen coming. We have a hard time. We have a hard time hanging on to what this might mean and what the implications of it all are when we start talking biology and
Sure.
yeah. So now, for me, the passage in Revelation makes Psalms 89 even better as we continue, and so we're going to read some really fun stuff. Verse 5, and this is Psalms 89, verse 5. Let the heavens praise your wonders, O Lord, your faithfulness in the assembly of the holy ones. So Revelation 4, from the seven spirits who are before his throne.
Right.
So you got that connection. Verse 6 of Psalm 89. For who in the skies can be compared to the Lord? Revelation 7. Behold, he who is coming in the clouds. Who among the heavenly beings? Again, Psalm 89. Revelation 5. Firstborn of the dead, the ruler of the kings of earth, freed us by his blood and loved us. So there's all these unique characteristics that he is not like anyone else of the heavenly beings in Revelation. Verse 7. And a God greatly to be feared in the council of the Holy One, and awesome above all who are around him. Revelation 6, and to him be glory and dominion forever and ever. So, God is going to rule over this council that fears him. And that they fit together so well.
Yeah.
And, even though the words aren't always exact, the themes and the concepts are completely identical.
hmm
And, to miss that it's to miss out on this great revelation of what God is doing and what he plans to do.
hmm
And it goes right back here to David. And the language about David connects us right back to Abraham. And Abraham, the language about him connects us right back to Genesis 6. And that takes us right back to Genesis 1.
hmm
And so this is something God is working out and has been working out since the dawn of time. And he hasn't lost control of it. He hasn't lost the plot. There is design and purpose within this plan. And somehow, in a crazy act of sovereignty, he has allowed us the ability to move within that plan and still be self-actualizing human beings in accepting him. We can
Right.
participate, and we aren't just little drones. So, but back to God, he's a wholly unique king who rules above all kings because he rules in the heavens. And so when we talk about this, the fulfillment exceeds all expectations. And so we also realize that nothing else could fulfill the conditions of the covenant as God lays it out.
Right.
And so if we accept that kings back in the time of David were gods or sons of God, or even just representatives of God, the only the true God could rule over them.
Hmm.
So this is why it's so important that David be adopted and God rule through him. Where now with Christ, Christ is God himself and therefore is the only fitting ruler over all of the earth.
Right.
David can rule over Israel as a foreshadowing, but only Jesus
Hmm.
could extend that realm, that reign. Or the realm. Verse 6, when the psalmist asks, "Who among the heavenly beings is like the Lord?" The Hebrew there is heavenly being, but it's Ben Elim, which is literally sons of the mighty, another title for God. Sons of God, and I know I don't have to prove this to most of our longtime listeners. I can't believe I can say we had longtime listeners, but anyway, for those who've been with us, sons of God always refers to a supernatural being. So when we're talking about the divine counsel imagery of Job 2, it's very clear there. Definitely divine beings. When we're talking about believers, we're talking about people who are supernaturally created because we become sons of God
Hmm.
through
Hmm.
salvation. Sons of God are always created. They're never born, with only one exception. Jesus is the only exception to that. And that's the reason why he's completely unique, because he's holy God and holy man simultaneously, neither one being independent of the other. And so this is why Jesus is capable and worthy to rule over humanity and the spiritual realm.
Makes sense.
It's his divine birthright. Nobody else is going to have that divine birthright. So this is why there's no other way to salvation except through Jesus.
Sure. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
This is what I love about having to sit down and put all this together. So verse 8, "O Lord, God of hosts, who is mighty as you are, O Lord, with your faithfulness all around you." Lord of hosts, typical title for God in Samuel. It's first uttered by our great gal Hannah. And this is the first person to define what the rule of the Messiah would be. It's a woman who gives us the picture of what it means to live under the reign of the Messiah. And if you're reading, take time, or if you're listening here, take time, pause for a second, go read 1 Samuel 2, hear what Hannah's prophecy is, and realize how much it applies not only to David, but it applies even more so to Jesus himself. So, Lord of hosts, Lord of legions also refers to the militaristic, that's a fun word to stumble over, aspects of God's reign. He is a God who commands armies and legions of angels. He is not just up there on his own doing nothing. He leads this army into war against those who oppose him. And unlike other gods, he is faithful. Art Scroll translates this verse as, "Your surrounding angels attest to your faithfulness."
Hmm.
So basically, the ones who know you the best, the ones who've been with you since the beginning of time, who've been at your throne, witnessing and praising your every move, have this thing to say about our God:
Mhm.
He's faithful. And so I really like that translation. I think the ESV sticks with a very literal translation, but it kind of, with your faithfulness all around you, you don't get that same imagery
Right.
there. So, verse 5 through 8, I'm not going to read those specifically. They present God as presiding over this heavenly council and reigning over the heavens and all who reside in. I think I just read those verses. Sorry, but you get this imagery. So God is in heaven. He's on his throne. He's resigning. residing over this divine council. And this is the basis for verses 9 through 14. And they focus on God's rule in creation. So we're going from heavens to earth. And the authority really does flow from the top down. God can only rule on earth because he rules in the heavens. And he is the creator of the earth. And he gets to determine who reigns on his behalf, what created being rules on his behalf here on earth. And so there really is this is not chaos. There is a logic and methodology to how this is working out. And it really is very obvious once you begin to look at the themes.
Right.
But a lot of times we don't look at the themes and we go, it's just a big mess. And it's like, no, you got to grab a thread.
Sure.
You grab one thread.
Well, I think that's probably a good place to
Oh,
break.
Are we really?
Yeah, we're at like an hour 4
seriously? I feel like I've been talking like 5 minutes.
We're at an hour 4 here. But I think that's a good place to break when we're talking about, we're talking about his rule in heaven. Next week we'll come back talk about his rule on earth.
Like, seriously? I did not realize we were talking
Can you
that
not
long.
see the timer from where you are?
I was in my notes.
Okay.
Like, I got so excited preparing this one.
Well, I know it's good stuff. But our listeners, if they're listening to us, they probably have other podcasts to get to, so they probably have their schedule worked out. And also, we want to make sure we have enough to get another episode in.
Oh, definitely.
So,
I mean, shoot, that was no problem at all on that.
Okay, well, sorry to make that abrupt. We'll be back in a few minutes for us next week for you, and we'll talk about God's rule in the earth. And I have some ideas about the next verse that I want to ask about and see if I'm right. So anyway, everyone, for that, come back next week. In the meantime, hit us up on Raven Creek SC on all the social media. RavenCreekSC.com is the website where you can find Joe Zaragoza with the commentarians, Change My Mind with Luke T. Harrington, and our newest member here, Josh Sherman.
Joshua.
Joshua Sherman. Yes, I'm sorry, and I was blanking on. I was trying to remember the name of his show. I could remember his name. Tending Our Nets. I don't know why I blanked on that, but go check those out. They're good stuff, and we will see you next time. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, a Raven Creek Social Club production. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you like what you've heard, please write us a review on iTunes or consider supporting us on patreon.com/RavenCreekSC. As always, thank you for listening, and don't forget to join us next week.